On a frigid Monday morning in the quiet suburbs outside Denver, the Colorado winter pressed down on the landscape with a heavy, breath-stealing chill. The air felt deadened, as if the cold had swallowed every echo, every whisper, every trace of warmth. Snow clung to rooftops like sheets of frozen silence, and dawn emerged reluctantly across a sky washed in faint gray. It was the kind of morning where the world looked hollow and muted, where something terrible could hide in plain sight. Inside her small Colorado home, Connie Large Bennett sensed the weight of the day before she even reached the phone. When it rang, its sharp trill sliced through the stillness with a tone that felt wrong, off-key, almost ominous. Instinct tightened her chest before she even picked up. Her brother was calling. His voice carried an urgency that made Connie's pulse thrum. He told her that Bruce and Debbie, her son and daughter-in-law, had not shown up for work that morning. They worked under Bruce's uncle as regional distributors for Bassett Furniture. Responsible, reliable, dependable. Missing work was unthinkable for them. Their employer had called the house repeatedly. No answer, no return call, no explanation. A hollow dread began spreading through Connie's stomach. She learned that Debbie's brother Larry had also tried calling. He had seen them just the night before. It had been Melissa's birthday. A celebration of her 8th year of life, 8 years of growing, laughing, learning, and brightening every room she entered. Connie remembered the evening vividly. The children had laughed. The frosting had smeared across little fingers. Debbie had created a warm, joyful atmosphere the way she always did. Everything had felt safe, normal, happy. Now, 12 hours later, none of it made sense. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Connie grabbed her keys and rushed out the door. The cold air slapped her face as she stepped outside, but she barely felt it. Her mind was already racing, her heart beating heavy and uneven. The drive to Bruce and Debbie's home was short, but every second felt stretched thin with fear. The streets she passed, the same ones she had driven through countless times, felt alien, unfamiliar, as though the world had subtly shifted overnight. When she pulled up to the Bennett home, everything looked deceptively ordinary. The snow on the driveway was undisturbed. The house was still, too still. Connie pushed forward. She stepped into the garage. Investigators met her with solemn expressions, faces that told her everything before a single word was spoken. They led her inside. What she saw next would stay with her for the rest of her life. As Connie stepped into the kitchen, the world seemed to tighten around her. The light dimmed. The air grew heavy. Time slowed. She looked to her right. There on the floor lay her son, Bruce Bennett. He had been struck repeatedly with a hammer. His face and head were mutilated. His throat had been cut with lethal force. His body was positioned in a way that suggested he had tried to fight back, tried to survive, tried to protect his family. Connie froze. Her heart seemed to stop. A sound escaped her, something between a gasp and a silent scream. A mother's grief breaking open. Investigators gently guided her away, but she moved like a sleepwalker, as though she weren't fully inside her own body anymore. They brought her toward the master bedroom. There she saw Debbie. Deborah Bennett lay lifeless on the bed, brutally bludgeoned to death. The violence inflicted upon her showed a level of savagery that seasoned detectives would later describe as unheard of. The young mother who had been wrapping presents, slicing cake, and laughing with her daughters the night before was gone. But the horror did not end there. They brought Connie to the children's bedroom. There she saw the smallest body of all 7-year-old Melissa Bennett. Melissa had also been struck with a hammer. She had also been sexually assaulted. The cruelty inflicted upon her was beyond comprehension. A child's bedroom, a place of innocence, toys, and bedtime stories, had been transformed into a crime scene that shook even hardened investigators. One detective later recalled that every person who stepped into the scene turned pale. Men with years on the job felt sick. Some had to leave the room. The brutality was overwhelming. Yet somehow, unbelievably, there was one ray of hope. Little Vanessa had survived. 3-year-old Vanessa Bennett had been discovered wedged between the bed and the wall, barely breathing, barely conscious, covered in severe injuries, but alive. When fire rescue arrived, they saw her small body crumpled in that narrow space. They carefully lifted her and rushed her outside into the freezing morning. She was taken immediately to the hospital, the cold air biting at her skin as paramedics fought to keep her alive. Vanessa's injuries were brutal. Her head was wrapped in layers of bandages. Her face was swollen. Her body bore the marks of a vicious attack that should have taken her life. But she held on. Years later, Vanessa remembered fragments, sticky electrodes attached to her chest, hospital lights, muffled voices. She did not remember being told her parents were gone. She simply understood. Detectives tried interviewing her gently, hoping her young mind might carry even a flicker of memory. A face, a shadow, a voice. But trauma had buried everything. When a therapist tried asking what the attacker looked like, Vanessa became agitated, frightened, deeply distressed. The session was stopped immediately. She was too young, too injured, and too traumatized to recall anything useful. With their only surviving witness unable to help, investigators faced a grim reality. They had almost no leads, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no clear motive, a murder weapon that seemed to vanish into thin air. But they did have one piece of evidence, a piece that would become pivotal years later. Semen found on the carpet and the comforter in the children's room. However, in the mid-1980s, DNA analysis was not yet capable of identifying a specific individual. The evidence was ahead of the science, and the case began to freeze. As investigators struggled to make sense of the Bennett murders, they became aware of another brutal attack that had occurred only days earlier. On January 10th of 1984, just 6 days before the Bennett murders, Patricia Smith of Lakewood, Colorado, was found bludgeoned to death inside her home. She, too, had been sexually assaulted. She, too, had been struck repeatedly with a hammer. The similarities were chilling. A hammer, a sexual assault, a home invasion, a family attacked violently inside their private sanctuary. No signs of forced entry. A level of brutality described as frenzied, explosive, almost animalistic. Investigators suspected the same offender, but suspicion was not evidence. With no DNA analysis available and no witnesses, both cases began drifting toward the cold case files. And yet, beneath the surface, the evidence sat waiting, frozen in time until the science of a new era would thaw it. For 11 years, the Bennett case remained unsolved. 11 years of unanswered questions. 11 years of a killer walking free. 11 years of a small surviving girl growing up without her family. 11 years of investigators haunted by a case that refused to leave them. Then, in the mid-1990s, forensic science took a monumental leap. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, finally gained the capability to analyze old biological evidence and generate viable DNA profiles. They tested the semen collected in the Bennett home, and the results were staggering. The DNA profile they extracted was rare, so rare that only one person in tens of millions could match it. They now had their killer's genetic signature. But he was not in any database. The profile sat there, complete, perfect, unmistakable, and unmatched. The killer had no prior DNA on file. He had never submitted a DNA sample. He had never been arrested for a crime requiring a sample. It was a perfect answer to a locked door with no key yet. For years, the Bennett murders remained a wound in the heart of Colorado's investigative community. Detectives spoke about the case in hushed tones, frustrated by the absence of leads and haunted by the cruelty inflicted upon an innocent family. The case file grew thicker with every passing year, each page a reminder of the darkness one man had brought into a warm, loving home. But progress has a way of catching up to even the coldest of crimes. By the late 1990s, forensic science underwent a transformation. DNA testing, once limited and imprecise, had evolved into a powerful investigative tool. Laboratories across the country were now capable of generating profiles from biological material that had previously yielded nothing. DNA databases expanded. Technology accelerated. What had once felt impossible suddenly became attainable. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation held on to the Bennett evidence with the quiet hope that one day the science would advance enough to give them a second chance. That day came nearly 11 years after the murders. The semen recovered from Melissa's room evidence collected with painstaking care in 1984 was re-examined using newly available technology. Scientists at CBI worked carefully, knowing that the sample, fragile and decades old, held the key to a crime that had long resisted answers. When the results came back, investigators felt a shift, an almost electric sense of possibility. The DNA profile extracted from the sample was clear, strong, undeniable, and incredibly rare. Only one person in roughly 18 million could match it. A genetic fingerprint as unique as a face. A biological truth that would not lie. Detectives believed they were on the cusp of identifying the killer. But then came the disappointment. The profile did not match anyone inside CODIS, the national DNA database. The killer had never left a trace in any system. He had no recorded DNA, no felony convictions requiring DNA submission. No previous case that crossed the database's radar. The profile existed in a void, perfect yet useless on its own. Years passed. Investigators watched as other cold cases were solved through the database. They watched names appear for crimes long considered unsolvable. They waited for the day the Bennett case would join them. But decades continued to roll by. The killer remained a ghost. Until the early 2010s, when a revolutionary new field emerged and rewrote the future of forensic investigation. Genetic genealogy was not born inside police departments or crime labs. It began with everyday people searching for their family histories on new consumer DNA platforms, websites like Ancestry and the newer GED Match, where users voluntarily uploaded genetic data to explore their ancestry. These databases were not intended for law enforcement, but they held something law enforcement had never possessed before. Millions of DNA profiles belonging to people who were related, however distantly, to individuals who had never entered a criminal database. Even if a killer had never given a DNA sample, never been convicted of a qualifying offense, never been arrested, he still had relatives, cousins, great-aunts, people who had nothing to do with his crimes but shared fragments of his genetic code. And those fragments could lead investigators to him. Colorado detectives, desperate for progress, reached out to one of the pioneers of forensic genealogy, Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. Dr. Fitzpatrick, known for her courage in tackling seemingly impossible genetic puzzles, received the killer's DNA profile. Within days, she began building family trees branch by branch, generation by generation, searching for a name, a connection, a match. She worked with open-source DNA databases, comparing thousands of entries against the Bennett profile, looking for shared genetic markers that hinted at relatives. Each discovery brought her closer to identifying the family line the killer belonged to. It took less than a week. When she called investigators, her voice carried the certainty of scientific truth. She told them the surname associated with the killer's DNA was Ewing. The name meant nothing to the detectives. They had never heard it in connection to the Bennett case. It appeared nowhere in the reports. No witnesses had ever mentioned it. No neighbors had identified it. No prior tips included it. But science did not care about what anyone had expected. The killer had a name, and his past would soon reveal the depths of his violence. On a warm July evening in the year 2018, investigator Steve Connor received a phone call that would change everything. His supervisor delivered the news with a mixture of disbelief and relief. A CODIS hit had come through. The Bennett family killer had been identified. His DNA had matched an inmate in Nevada, someone who had been imprisoned for decades. His name was Alex Ewing. Investigators stared at the information in front of them. The file of a man who had slipped through their grasp for more than 30 years. A man who had committed violent attacks shortly after the Bennett murders, leaving a bloody trail across state lines. A man who had nearly escaped detection forever. Ewing had been in prison since August of 1984, just months after the Bennett family was destroyed. Now, detectives needed to know why. They began reviewing his criminal history. What they found was terrifying. Only 12 days after the Bennett murders, Ewing had been arrested in Kingman, Arizona for attacking a man with a rock, an assault so savage that the victim barely survived. Law enforcement soon linked Ewing to yet another attack, this time involving an axe handle where 2 victims had been bludgeoned nearly to death. The pattern was unmistakable. A weapon of opportunity. A blitz-style attack. Frenzied violence. The intent to kill without hesitation or remorse. After those assaults, Ewing fled but was soon captured in Nevada. He was convicted of attempted murder and imprisoned. For decades, all the while, the Bennett family case went cold. Yet the DNA remained, waiting, sleeping, preserved perfectly enough for science to resurrect it at the right moment. With the match confirmed and the genealogy pointing toward the same name, Colorado investigators were finally face to face with the truth. Alex Ewing was the killer, and justice, delayed for more than 3 decades, was finally within reach. When detectives sat down with Ewing inside the Nevada facility, they approached cautiously. They knew who he was. They knew what he had done. They knew the DNA evidence was irrefutable. But they wanted to see how he would react. During the initial questioning, Ewing appeared confused, shifting between shock and vague denial. When confronted with the fact that the evidence pointed directly at him, he asked whether he needed an attorney. His reactions lacked the outrage or disbelief of an innocent man. But the detectives were not there for confessions. They were there to confirm what the DNA already said. And DNA does not lie. After decades of searching, the killer had been found. Now Colorado needed to bring him home. Colorado charged Ewing with the first-degree murder of Bruce Bennett, Deborah Bennett, and 7-year-old Melissa Bennett. They also charged him with the murder of Patricia Smith, whose brutal death mirrored the Bennett case in nearly every way. The legal process moved slowly. Ewing fought extradition. But science had tied his identity to 4 murders. Colorado prosecutors were relentless. Eventually, Ewing was transported back to the state whose cold winter he had once used as a backdrop for unimaginable violence. The trial that followed would finally shine a light on the darkness he had carried inside him. The Bennett case was tried first. Prosecutors described Ewing's actions as driven by absolute bloodlust. They told the jury about the hammer attacks, the sexual assault of a child, the brutality inflicted with savage force, the trauma inflicted on a tiny survivor, the decades spent with no answers. They showed the DNA evidence. They showed the timelines. They showed the similarity to his other violent offenses. The jury listened. They watched. They examined every detail. When the verdict was read, the courtroom felt frozen in time. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Ewing was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge called his crimes an abomination, a word rare in legal proceedings but fitting for the destruction he caused. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. Justice had arrived late, but undeniable. And yet, one case still remained. While the Bennett family had finally received a measure of justice, one more life still waited for its own reckoning. Patricia Smith, whose murder had occurred only 6 days before the Bennetts were attacked, had been left in the cold case files for more than 3 decades. Her family had lived those years in a haze of sorrow and confusion. No suspect, no answers, no justice. Now, the same science that had resurrected the Bennett case illuminated Patricia's case as well. The DNA recovered from her crime scene bore the same genetic signature, the same violent hands, the same brutality, the same frenzy of a killer whose rage seemed to ignite like wildfire inside quiet suburban homes. The prosecutors in Jefferson County announced that they would pursue the case against Ewing. Though he already faced 3 consecutive life sentences, the moral weight of Patricia's murder demanded its own courtroom, its own verdict, its own acknowledgement of the horror she endured. But before that would happen, the legal system needed to move through its careful, methodical steps. Extradition battles, hearings, motions, reviews of evidence that had slept for decades. Meanwhile, Colorado residents revisited memories of 1984, one of the darkest months in the state's history, when a hammer-wielding stranger moved unseen through family neighborhoods. For some, the arrest of Ewing was a vindication of their long-held fears. They had always believed a single predator was responsible for the string of crimes. Now, they finally had a name. For others, it was a reopening of old wounds, proof that the unspeakable horrors experienced by their loved ones would finally be acknowledged for what they were. Deliberate acts of calculated brutality. But for Vanessa Bennett, the lone surviving child, something even deeper stirred beneath the surface. Her past, which had been clouded by trauma and fragmented memories, now had a face, one she had never seen, but had always lived in the shadow of. A man whose rage had stolen her family, her childhood, and the life she should have known. Though she had grown into adulthood with strength and resilience, the final identification of the killer was a powerful, complicated moment, a mixture of closure and loss, relief and resurfaced grief. The truth had finally emerged from the abyss, and now it would return to the courtroom. Survivors often speak of trauma as something that never fully fades, it simply changes shape. For Vanessa Bennett, the trauma she carried was not only about what she lived through, but also about what she lost. She had been 3 years old when she was brutally attacked. 3 years old when she lost her mother, father, and older sister. 3 years old when the world she knew shattered into pieces that would never fully fit together again. Those who worked with her in the years that followed described her as remarkably strong. Even as a child, she demonstrated a resilience that defied explanation, perhaps because she was too young to fully understand the enormity of what had happened. Or perhaps because, deep inside, she had inherited her parents' quiet strength. As she grew older, the details of her past were explained to her carefully, lovingly, and gradually. Each revelation landed with a weight that took time to carry. Her family, those who remained, protected her fiercely. They shielded her from the darker details until she was old enough to process them. Vanessa herself has said that she does not remember the attack. She does not remember the man's face. She does not remember the sound of the blows or the coldness of the house on that January morning. Trauma had buried the memories, sealing them away like a locked room inside her mind. But the impacts lived on. Nightmares, moments of sudden fear, flashes of anxiety in quiet rooms, a longing for people she could no longer remember clearly, the weight of being the only one who survived. Yet Vanessa refused to allow the past to define her entire story. She grew up, pursued education, built relationships, and embraced adulthood with determination. Her life became a testament to survival, to the idea that even the darkest nightmares could not extinguish her spirit. When she learned the identity of the man who nearly killed her, she reacted not with rage, but with clarity. She felt sadness for her family. She felt a sense of completion. And she felt gratitude that science had finally caught a man who once seemed untouchable. The case had always been personal for investigators, but for Vanessa, it was her entire childhood. Her whole origin story laid bare under the light of justice. And now, with the world finally knowing the truth, the narrative moved toward a final judicial confrontation. By the time the Bennett trial began, Ewing had spent more than 3 decades behind prison walls in Nevada. Age had worn down his face, softening the hard lines of a man who once prowled houses under cover of night. He was no longer the young, unpredictable predator he had been in 1984. But inside the courtroom, none of that mattered. What mattered were the lives he had destroyed. Prosecutors presented the crimes in excruciating detail. They walked jurors through the Bennett home room by room, body by body, until the horror of the crime scene was unmistakable. They described the hammer blows, the overpowering force, the sexual assault, the violent frenzy, the chilling calm that must have followed. And then they presented the DNA, undeniable, irrefutable, a silent witness preserved across decades. The defense attempted to argue contamination. They attempted to poke holes in chain of custody records. They attempted to cast doubt on the new science of genetic genealogy. But the evidence stood firm. Jurors, sitting quietly, with their hands folded, listened to every detail. They absorbed the story of a family destroyed by a man with no connection to them, no motive beyond violence, no reason beyond the storm inside him. When the verdict came, the courtroom breathed as one. Guilty of first-degree murder for Bruce Bennett. Guilty of first-degree murder for Deborah Bennett. Guilty of first-degree murder for Melissa Bennett. The judge, a seasoned figure in Colorado's judiciary, described the murders as an abomination. Ewing received 3 consecutive life sentences, 3 lives taken, 3 lives honored, 3 punishments that would ensure he never walked free. But the justice system was not done with him yet. The murder of Patricia Smith predated the Bennett killings by 6 days. 6 days that separated two nearly identical crimes. 6 days that marked the initial escalation of a predator's violence. Patricia had been at home in Lakewood on January 10th of 1984 when she was attacked. She too had been sexually assaulted. She too had been bludgeoned with a hammer. She too had suffered the same pattern of violence that would strike the Bennetts less than a week later. The parallels were impossible to ignore. When the DNA match identified Ewing, prosecutors moved forward with the Smith case. Though he already faced life behind bars, they believed her family deserved their own verdict. Her trial moved slowly, hindered by delays and legal maneuvers, but the evidence remained strong. The same DNA that had sealed Ewing's fate in the Bennett trial tied him firmly to Patricia's murder. Colorado's justice system was deliberate, careful, and precise. They refused to let time weaken the truth. And when Ewing eventually stands trial for Patricia's murder, the evidence will speak for her just as it did for the Bennetts. The Bennett murders did not only devastate one family, they sent shockwaves through the entire region. For months after the killings, Colorado residents locked their doors earlier, checked windows twice, and looked cautiously at every unfamiliar car parked on a quiet street. It was as if an invisible shadow had passed over the community, leaving an imprint that would take decades to fade. Neighbors who once waved at each other across driveways now hesitated. Parents kept children indoors more often. Home security systems, rare in the early 1980s, suddenly became topics of conversation at dinner tables and neighborhood meetings. People whispered the same terrifying question: was the killer still out there? And for more than 3 decades, the answer lingered like a dark cloud. Yes, he was, sitting in a Nevada prison under a different conviction, while Colorado lived with fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. Though no one in Colorado knew his name during those years, his presence was felt. His crimes left psychological scars not only on the families involved, but on the entire community. Even those who had never met the Bennetts felt the weight of the murders. These were not random crimes of opportunity committed in a moment of desperation. They were acts of cruelty carried out with force and intention, violence delivered with a weapon that symbolized raw, unfiltered rage. Investigators who revisited the case over the years often described a sense of personal responsibility, an almost haunting compulsion to find the man who had taken so much from so many. Detectives retired. New ones stepped in. But the case never lost urgency. It never faded from memory. Each year, on the anniversary of the murders, some of those detectives would drive past the neighborhood, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. They remembered the family. They remembered the crime scene. And they remembered the child who survived. The Bennett case became a symbol of why cold case work mattered, why evidence must be preserved, why files must be kept open, why victims must never be forgotten. And when the science finally caught up, those years of persistence were rewarded with a name, a face, a history of violence that explained everything. To understand the crimes Ewing committed, investigators began piecing together his background. They wanted to know how a man like him had slipped so easily through the cracks. What had shaped him? What had driven him? What had triggered a wave of violence so explosive it left 4 victims dead and 1 child fighting for her life? Ewing was not a man with a known pattern of serial offending, not in the way criminology textbooks describe. He had no long criminal resume filled with escalating crimes. He had no documented history of childhood cruelty toward animals or early signs of predatory behavior. Instead, his rampage seemed to come from nowhere, like a sudden storm. But when investigators traced his movements across early 1984, a picture began to emerge. Ewing had been transient, moving through states without stable housing or routine employment. He drifted between Colorado, Arizona, and Nevada, leaving behind a trail of suspicion and an eventual path of confirmed violence. What investigators found most alarming was the randomness of his attacks. He did not target specific individuals. He did not have a known connection to any victim. He did not stalk them in the traditional sense. He simply entered homes often through open garages or unlocked doors and unleashed violence with overwhelming speed. Experts later suggested that Ewing fit the description of a spree offender rather than a serial killer. His crimes were clustered within a short period, fueled by impulsivity, rage, and a desire for control. He used whatever weapon he could find inside the homes: hammers, rocks, axe handles, suggesting his attacks were not pre-planned but opportunistic. This unpredictability made him even more dangerous. Had he not been apprehended in Nevada for the attempted murder of 2 people, it is likely the violence would have continued. How many families might have been next? How many more children might have been injured or killed? How long would his rampage have lasted? These questions haunted investigators. They understood now that the arrest in Nevada had inadvertently saved countless lives. While the Bennett case remained unsolved for decades, the violence stopped. And though it was heartbreaking to know the Bennetts never lived to see justice, it was clear that their deaths prevented others. Ewing's capture ended the storm, but the aftermath lingered for generations. It is easy to forget, in a world where DNA results can be produced in hours, just how groundbreaking forensic technology was in the 1990s and early 2000s. When the Bennett evidence was preserved, investigators did not know what the future held. They only hoped that one day science would be advanced enough to extract the truth. Their patience became part of the investigation itself. The semen found on the carpet and comforter in Melissa's room remained stable. Temperature-controlled storage, careful cataloging, evidence protocols designed to preserve biological material indefinitely. Because of this meticulous preservation, the DNA profile extracted years later was pristine, strong enough to withstand challenges, clear enough to appear in court, complete enough to connect directly to Ewing with unwavering certainty. This success became a blueprint for future cases. It demonstrated that evidence, even after decades, could speak loudly and clearly if stored correctly. It encouraged departments nationwide to revisit evidence from cold cases, particularly those involving biological material. The Bennett case would later be cited in law enforcement seminars, forensic conferences, and academic journals as an example of why cold case evidence must never be discarded. But the most revolutionary part of the process, the part that changed everything, was genetic genealogy. Without that discipline, Ewing might never have been connected to the crimes. Even with a full DNA profile, he had no match in national databases. The profile was only useful if a relative had voluntarily submitted their DNA to a genealogy site, and someone had. A distant relative, unknown to investigators and likely unaware of Ewing himself, had uploaded their DNA to trace their ancestry. This small act, unrelated to crime, opened a path to justice that traditional police work could not provide. DNA does not forget. DNA does not lie. DNA does not grow old. It waits. And when the right technology arrives, it speaks. Though Ewing had been identified in 2018, the path to bringing him to trial was slow and complex. Extradition between states required hearings, paperwork, and rulings that could take months or even years. Ewing fought extradition from Nevada to Colorado. It was not surprising Colorado was seeking charges that carried the most severe punishments available. Facing the evidence would mean confronting crimes he had avoided accountability for over 3 decades. Legal experts debated his case in news interviews and articles. Some saw his extradition battle as a delaying tactic. Others viewed it as a sign of fear of the DNA, fear of the truth, fear of finally standing trial for the murders he thought he had escaped. Families of the victims waited. Vanessa waited. Colorado waited. But the justice system moved with determination, refusing to let bureaucracy hinder the long-awaited confrontation between a community and the man who had terrified it. Eventually, the courts ruled in Colorado's favor. Ewing was extradited. The trial would proceed, and the people of Colorado would finally hear the evidence laid out in full. When Alex Ewing finally entered the Colorado courtroom, the years had changed him. He was older, slower, and visibly diminished. But the crimes he committed remained as stark and horrifying as they were in January of 1984. Time had softened his appearance, but nothing could soften the truth. The families of the victims filled the seats behind the prosecution. Investigators who had carried the case across decades sat among them. Courtroom staff, reporters, and members of the community watched with quiet anticipation. Some had waited their entire adult lives for this moment. Ewing appeared in shackles, escorted by deputies, his expression unreadable. He glanced around the room only briefly before lowering his eyes. It was the first time he would hear, in a formal, public setting, the full weight of what he had done. The prosecution began with the story as they always do. But this story was not merely a recitation of facts. It was a reconstruction of lives, interrupted, dreams shattered, and a future stolen from an entire family. Bruce Bennett, Deborah Bennett, little Melissa Bennett. Their names echoed across the courtroom, each one a reminder of a life violently taken. The prosecution described the brutality in calm, measured tones. They explained the hammer blows. They explained the sexual assault of a child. They explained the medical findings that proved the cruelty inflicted on the family. They presented the crime scene photographs, careful to follow courtroom guidelines and avoid anything unduly graphic for jurors, yet still revealing the truth of the violence. Then came the DNA. The scientist from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation walked the jury through the entire process, how the evidence was collected, preserved, and tested, how the profile created in the 1990s matched the updated genetic genealogy lead, how the CODIS hit from Nevada confirmed the match beyond any reasonable doubt. The jury listened closely. Some avoided the projections of the crime scene. Others looked directly, faces stiff with concentration and grief. Every detail painted a picture of a man whose violence had cut a family tree at the roots. The defense could offer little in response. They attempted to challenge the DNA. They argued about degradation, cross-contamination, and the chain of custody from decades earlier. They questioned the role of genealogy in a criminal investigation. But each argument fell apart under scrutiny. The evidence was too strong. When closing arguments began, the prosecution delivered a powerful statement. This family lived their last moments in fear. They died in terror. And the only surviving member, a 3-year-old child, spent decades not knowing who stole her family. Today, we restore that truth. Today, we return the truth to the only person who lived through that nightmare. The jury's verdict was swift. Guilty on all counts. As the foreperson read the verdict, the courtroom remained silent, a silence filled with the weight of 30-plus years of unanswered prayers. The judge's voice broke that silence. These murders were an abomination. 3 consecutive life sentences. Justice, delayed for decades, had finally arrived. The verdict in the Bennett case did not end the story. It did not erase the decades of grief. It did not bring back Bruce, Deborah, or Melissa. But it did provide answers that had been buried under the cold of 1984 for far too long. For investigators, the conviction represented the culmination of a career-long pursuit, proof that persistence matters, that cold cases can be solved, and that justice can prevail even when the path is slow and steep. For the community, it brought closure. For some, it reopened old emotions. For others, it justified the fear they once carried when the murders first happened. And for Vanessa Bennett, it brought clarity, a name to the faceless nightmare that had altered the course of her entire life. But justice does not always bring peace. Sometimes it simply brings truth. Vanessa spoke publicly after the conviction. She did not speak with rage. She did not call for vengeance. She spoke instead with humility, strength, and a quiet resilience that deeply moved those who heard her. She said she felt grateful for the investigators who never stopped working, grateful for the advancements in science, grateful that the man who destroyed her family could no longer hurt anyone else. Her story became one of survival, not just physical survival, but emotional endurance. The Bennett case became widely known as one of the most significant cold cases solved through forensic genealogy. News outlets across the country covered the story, emphasizing the power of DNA, the patience of investigators, and the courage of the surviving child. Yet behind the headlines, behind the courtrooms and interviews, lay a truth that resonated much deeper. Even in unimaginable darkness, resilience can grow. While the Bennett trial had concluded, the case of Patricia Smith still pressed forward. Her family had waited far too long for the truth. Though Ewing had already received multiple life sentences, the law demanded that Patricia's murder be addressed individually. Her case held emotional weight for the community of Lakewood. The murder had stunned them in 1984, and for decades it remained a source of fear and confusion. Now, the DNA made the connection undeniable. Her killer was the same man who had attacked the Bennetts. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they retraced the steps of the original investigation. They met with Patricia's surviving family members. They reviewed the autopsy report. They examined photographs and notes that had sat undisturbed in storage for 30-plus years. The brutality mirrored the Bennett crimes so closely that investigators began describing Ewing not just as violent, but as predatory, someone who thrived on the vulnerability of families alone in their homes. Though Ewing's physical appearance had aged significantly by the time of the Smith case proceedings, the shadow of his crimes remained vivid. His past could not be softened by gray hair or slower steps. His actions were frozen in the winter of 1984, preserved as clearly as the DNA that betrayed him. Colorado intended to ensure Patricia Smith received the same justice as the Bennetts. And though the legal proceedings moved slowly, the truth had already been restored. The Bennett family murders have become a landmark case in the history of American forensic investigation. Their legacy is multi-layered, touching fields like forensic science, genealogy, cold case investigation, victim advocacy, DNA technology, interagency cooperation. The case represents the power of evidence preservation. Officers in 1984 could not have anticipated the technology available 40 years later. Yet they handled the evidence as if the future depended on it because it did. Today, law enforcement agencies cite the Bennett case as a justification for re-examining cold case biological evidence, maintaining long-term preservation protocols, using genealogical databases to identify offenders' manna, combining traditional police work with modern science to fare. And most significantly, the case inspired families of cold case victims to regain hope. If a case this old, nearly 40 years, could be solved with precision, then others could be too. The Bennett murders now stand as a reminder that time does not erase truth, it only delays it. And truth, once uncovered, can echo across generations. Even after decades had passed, the Bennett family murders remained etched in the collective memory of Aurora and the surrounding Colorado communities. People who were children in 1984 grew into adults with their own families, yet the fear they witnessed during that winter stayed with them. Some recalled how their parents began locking doors obsessively, even in neighborhoods where trust had once been the norm. Others remembered hushed conversations at grocery stores, whispered warnings at bus stops, and the unspoken agreement that something evil had passed through their streets. Aurora was not a city defined by violence. It was a place of families, schools, small businesses, and ordinary routines. But the murders cracked that sense of security. In the weeks that followed, police patrols increased. Neighborhood watches formed. Community meetings drew record crowds. Residents demanded answers, but investigators had none to give. When the case eventually went cold, fear lingered like an unfinished sentence. Parents kept nightlights in their children's rooms long after the immediate threat had passed. Couples double-checked their locks even in broad daylight. And members of the community carried the quiet grief of knowing a family had been erased. Every year, when January approached, people remembered. Some placed flowers near the Bennett home, even decades later. Others silently lit candles. A few made private vows never to forget the names of Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa. And many watched Vanessa's life from a respectful distance, quietly rooting for her to overcome the darkness she had endured. The arrest of Ewing in 2018 revived old emotions. Newspapers ran headlines that stirred memories many had worked to bury. Television stations replayed archive footage of detectives speaking in the mid-'80s about a killer who left no trace. But now, Colorado had a name, and the sense of communal relief was palpable. The community that had once lived in fear could finally breathe again, not because the tragedy had healed, but because the truth had finally returned. Justice, long delayed, was finally being delivered. Behind every cold case that finally reaches resolution is a team of investigators who refuse to let the story fade. The Bennett case was no exception. Through retirements, promotions, transfers, and departmental changes, the case file passed through the hands of many detectives, each adding new notes, new theories, new timelines. Some described the case as the one that never slept. Others said it became part of who they were as investigators. They attended trainings on forensic advancements, always asking whether new technology could help with the Bennett evidence. They visited labs to speak with scientists. They reviewed the file repeatedly, looking for any small detail that earlier investigators might have missed. Some detectives confessed that the Bennett family visited their dreams. The horror of the crime scene, the emptiness of the house, the lone surviving child, it all stayed with them. Cold case work requires a unique kind of patience. There are no fresh tips, no new witnesses, no active leads, just evidence waiting for the right moment. And in the Bennett case, the evidence waited more than 3 decades. But the investigators never stopped believing the case would be solved. And when the breakthrough finally came first through genetic genealogy, then through the CODIS match, many of those retired detectives received phone calls from former colleagues. Some cried, some stood in silence, some whispered, "Finally." Some prayed. Years of frustration turned instantly into vindication. In interviews, several investigators later said, the Bennett case reminded them why they chose the profession in the first place to seek justice, even when the odds seemed impossible. Their persistence built the bridge that carried the case from 1984 into the modern age of forensic science. The Bennett case would become one of the earliest, most impactful examples of how forensic genealogy could break open cold cases once thought unsolvable. When Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick received the killer's DNA profile, she approached it not as a crime scene sample, but as a puzzle, one that could be solved by tracing shared genetic markers among thousands of people. Her work involved comparing the Bennett DNA profile to voluntary submissions in open-source genealogy databases. She looked for distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, sometimes even smaller shared DNA segments that hinted at family branches. Piece by piece, she constructed a family tree. But family trees are complicated. They twist across states, generations, marriages, and migrations. Hundreds of names may appear before one specific line stands out. And within days, one name emerged from the branches: Ewing. That one name cracked a case that had been frozen in time. The method used to identify Ewing would later become standard practice for law enforcement investigating cold cases. It showed that even without a direct DNA match in a criminal database, a killer could still be identified through relatives who had never committed a crime. This method would later solve dozens of other cold cases across the country, catching murderers and sexual offenders long after they believed they were safe. The Bennett case became a symbol of this revolution. It demonstrated that forensic genealogy was not a novelty. It was a powerful tool capable of bringing answers to families who had waited far too long, and it proved, once and for all, that science never stops fighting for the truth. As the trial ended and the verdicts were read, many eyes turned to Vanessa Bennett, the lone survivor of the rampage that had destroyed her family. Her life, shaped by tragedy, was also shaped by courage. She grew up determined not to be defined by the violence that nearly took her life. Though she bore physical and emotional scars from the attack, she refused to let those scars steal her future. In adulthood, she chose to share parts of her story publicly, not for attention, but to acknowledge the investigators, scientists, and community members who fought for justice alongside her. She thanked the officers who preserved the evidence. She thanked the prosecutors who built the case. She thanked the scientists whose discoveries brought answers. Her voice became a testament to the strength that emerges when trauma is met with resilience rather than surrender. When news reporters asked how she felt about the verdict, Vanessa spoke simply, "I'm grateful. I'm grateful we finally have the truth." Her words carried the weight of nearly 40 years. She did not speak with bitterness. She did not speak with hatred. She spoke with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived the darkest night imaginable. Her story, though born from tragedy, became a beacon of hope for survivors of violent crime everywhere. She showed that healing is possible. She showed that justice can still arrive after decades. She showed that one person's survival can inspire an entire nation. The Bennett case is now taught in criminal justice courses, forensic science programs, and cold case seminars across the United States. It stands as evidence that cold cases can be solved after 30 or 40 years. Evidence preservation is essential. DNA does not degrade when properly stored. Science continues evolving faster than criminals can escape. Justice has no expiration date. Students studying forensic genealogy often analyze the Bennett case as a foundational example of how distant genetic relationships can lead to the identification of an offender. Investigators use the case to demonstrate the importance of cross-checking violent crimes across state lines, especially when offenders move frequently. Victim advocates cite the case as proof that families should never lose hope that even the darkest cases can eventually find daylight. And across the country, departments have reopened cases once deemed unsolvable, inspired by the Bennett investigation. The legacy of the Bennett family has become intertwined with the evolution of forensic justice itself. Their story helped shape a new era, one where science can travel backward in time and restore truth long buried. Though Vanessa Bennett survived the attack physically, the psychological impact of what happened in January of 1984 shaped her life in profound ways. Trauma endured in early childhood behaves differently inside the human mind. At 3 years old, Vanessa was too young for fully developed episodic memory. Her brain, overwhelmed by fear, pain, and confusion, shut down the ability to store visual recollections of the event. Experts later explained that her lack of memory was not a failure, but a form of protection. When trauma exceeds what a young mind can process, the brain locks the memories behind barriers so firm they may never resurface. In Vanessa's case, this meant she grew up without the visual burden of the attack, but not without its emotional resonance. Trauma leaves traces, even when the memories themselves vanish. She carried anxiety in unfamiliar spaces, sensitivity to sudden noises, fear of being alone, a sense of loss she could not fully articulate, a longing for a family she knew only through stories and photographs. As she grew older, her relatives carefully explained what had happened to her. They did not overwhelm her with details. They offered fragments, spaced across years, allowing her to integrate the truth gradually. The attack had taken her family, but it had not taken her identity. She became a young woman who understood her origins were steeped in tragedy, yet she refused to let that tragedy consume her. Teachers, counselors, and friends described her as strong, soft-spoken, and remarkably grounded. She carried a calmness that belied the storm she had survived. Her resilience, they said, was a reminder that the human spirit can endure even the darkest chapters. When she eventually spoke about her past publicly, she did so with grace, not bitterness. She wanted the world to know her family, not for how they died, but for how they lived. In many ways, Vanessa became the living legacy of the Bennett family, proof that even when cruelty tries to erase an entire lineage, survival can reclaim the story. Investigators who revisited the Bennett crime scene over the decades described it as one of the most haunting cases they ever encountered. The layout of the home remained etched in their memories. The kitchen, where Bruce was found, its tile floor cold and quiet. The master bedroom, where Deborah fought for her life. The children's room, where innocence had been shattered. The small space where tiny Vanessa hid between the bed and the wall, clinging to life. No matter how many years passed, detectives could still picture the details with disturbing clarity. The house itself became a symbol of unanswered questions, a frozen moment in time. When the case was finally reopened through DNA advancements, investigators again studied the photos. Some described feeling transported back to 1984. The objects in the home were simple children's toys, family photographs, blankets, birthday decorations, but their stillness told the story of lives abruptly and violently interrupted. One investigator later said, "Every time I looked at that file, I felt like the house was still asking us to finish the story." That sense of unfinished business fueled the determination that kept the case alive. Even when years passed without any new leads, the evidence remained a silent insistence that justice was possible. And when the DNA match finally arrived, investigators felt an almost spiritual sense of closure, not only for themselves, but for the home that had held the memory of that morning for so long. The Bennett murders became known far beyond Colorado. National crime analysts, forensic researchers, investigative journalists, and cold case experts all studied the case for multiple reasons. First, the brutality of the crime itself drew widespread attention. Random home invasions followed by extreme violence had the power to shake communities across the United States. People saw the Bennett murders not as a localized tragedy, but as a reminder of how vulnerable everyday life could be. Second, the survival of a 3-year-old child made the case especially memorable. Stories of lone survivors often capture public attention because they carry both heartbreak and hope. Vanessa Bennett's survival became a symbol of resilience that resonated across the country. Third, the scientific breakthrough was a national milestone. Genetic genealogy was still emerging as a powerful forensic tool. The Bennett case validated its use in serious crimes and demonstrated its potential to solve cases once dismissed as unsolvable. News outlets covered the story extensively. It appeared in national news broadcasts, true crime documentaries, forensic science conferences, legal discussions, university lectures, journals on criminology and DNA technology. The case also influenced national policy discussions on cold case funding. Lawmakers referenced the Bennett resolution as evidence that old cases deserved continued investment. Some argued that every piece of biological evidence should be preserved indefinitely because future technologies would likely render them usable even after 50 or 60 years. The Bennett murders were no longer simply a Colorado tragedy. They became part of the national conversation about justice, science, and the future of forensic investigation. Even with the conviction of Ewing, the case left lingering questions that investigators discussed quietly among themselves, knowing they might never find the answers. Why the Bennetts? There was no clear motive, no connection, no reason he chose their home. Why the extreme brutality? Some experts suggested an explosive anger triggered by personal frustrations. Others speculated that Ewing experienced a psychological break, but no clinical diagnosis could fully explain the cruelty inflicted. Did he intend to kill all of them from the beginning? Evidence suggested he used whatever weapons he found inside the home. But the sheer force of the attacks indicated a level of rage far beyond a spontaneous act. What would have happened if he had not been arrested in Nevada? Investigators believed more murders might have followed. The pattern suggested he was escalating rapidly. Did he feel remorse? Nothing in Ewing's behavior during interviews or trial suggested remorse. He denied responsibility rather than expressing regret. These questions lingered, not because investigators doubted their conclusions, but because motives in crimes of extreme violence often remain locked inside the mind of the offender. What mattered most was that the truth had emerged and the community was no longer haunted by a nameless figure. When the final verdicts were read, Colorado experienced a wave of relief. The story had come full circle. The community that once felt powerless now felt empowered by the outcome. For families of other cold case victims, the Bennett resolution became a beacon of hope. If a case from 1984 could be solved in the 2020s, then perhaps their loved ones' cases could be solved too. Cold case units saw a spike in public engagement. Families requested updates on unsolved murders. Investigators revisited old files with renewed determination. Laboratories received new requests to retest old evidence. The Bennett case had proven that time does not erase truth, it only delays it.